All right. Well, take us through. Um, First, Kirk gave a little bit of a glimpse into who Galileo was, what he's famous for, besides the controversial aspect that we're going to go into today. But is there anything he missed besides picking out a few moons, having them named after him? Why does he matter?
Are you talking to Kirk or me right
Oh,
now?
you, Michael. You,
Oh, I
Michael.
see. Okay, got it.
Kirk's already run through his
Well, he
Galileo expertise.
Very limited.
he is the inventor of the telescope. Although some Dutch people did kind of begin the process of using different lenses before he did, but he's the one that kind of put it all together and made it work best. So even if that's all he did, he's quite a guy. We're gonna see though that he really just was an obscure philosopher to start. Um, and But before I go too much into him, I want to present the model that he grabbed onto and wanted to um, get adopted by the other thinkers and the church at his time. And it was actually developed by Copernicus a century prior to Galileo, or almost a century prior to him. So in the early 16th century, Nicholas Copernicus placed the sun at the center with all the planets orbiting around it. And other than placing the sun at the center of the solar system, everything else in his book from 1543 was in fact mistaken. But he got that really important part right. But the scientific evidence that was available at that time didn't actually support Copernicus's model, or as we're going to see, it didn't even almost a century later. There wasn't the scientific evidence available to support the model when Galileo was pushing it as well. So Copernicus's system was no better than Ptolemy's for predicting astronomic events, which was the view that had been held for centuries. And just like Aristotle, who was the philosophy behind Ptolemy's view, and Ptolemy and most of the ancients, Copernicus began with this assumption that a perfect being would create heavenly bodies with perfectly circular orbits. So a perfect being is going to use the perfect shape when they're creating. And so obviously the orbits of the heavenly bodies would be perfectly circular. But that didn't actually fit with the observational evidence. Ptolemy had to put in some little fudges to make it work. And so did Copernicus. His new model didn't produce the same problems because he was working under the same presupposition. Circular orbits is what it had to be. So he had to do what Ptolemy had done, which is introduce some micro loops into the orbits to kind of better explain the patterns and the timing, make the timing of everything kind of work together. So even though now looking back, we say, what a fantastic discovery that Copernicus made, that the sun was the center of our solar system. He didn't really have the scientific backing to back it up as of yet. But then along comes Galileo.
So was it just a lucky guess?
Well, no. I mean, there's usually hypotheses have something going for it, right? But not enough to make it the balance of probabilities, or demonstrate that it's true, or make it more probable than the alternatives that were around.
But why would he pick that and get everything else wrong?
Well, it's just more complicated than we think. It's just more complicated than we think. When you're trying to change a paradigm that's been around for 1,000 years or more, you discover a few new things that seem to be correct and fit over here, and you're trying to make it fit somehow, but you just don't quite have enough proof yet, even though you feel strongly, intuitively, that there's something to this. And that's what Galileo did. Galileo felt intuitively there's something to this, and he had other reasons to think that the Earth was not the center of the universe. But Galileo was just initially an obscure professor, but he wasn't really a rebel, trying to take down the Catholic Church or destroy the other scholars of his time. But he did want fame. He did want fame. And so when the Dutch invented sort of a prototype of the telescope, he took that up and essentially invented what we call the telescope. And he got some fame, and he got some new positions and prestige and some money, and he was kind of on his way. He really wanted, though, to replace Aristotle as the man, as the authority on the workings of the cosmos. Now, this is interesting, looking at it from a Christian perspective, because Aristotle wasn't a Christian. In fact, Aristotle thought that the universe had always existed. It was eternal. So that was a sticking point with Christians who believed the universe wasn't eternal, but was created. But Aristotle seemed to be right in so many other ways that Christians, the church, just basically bought into so much of what he said, then they can just put the fact that he thought the universe was eternal off to the side and deal with that later. But Galileo became convinced that Aristotle was wrong about a whole bunch of things. But at this time in the church history, Aristotle had taken up sort of a new role of prominence in the church after his writings got translated back into Latin and were made available. The church really grabbed hold of it. Thomas Aquinas was a scholar of Aristotle and basically expanded upon Aristotle's views. Although a little side point that I've always found interesting, though, Aquinas's 5 proofs for God all were done in the context of Aristotle's belief that the universe is eternal. So he's kind of like somebody doing evangelism or apologetics in our current culture. You want to know what the current culture thinks, and so you want to be relevant to them. So instead of focusing his attention on countering Aristotle's view of the eternality of the universe, Aquinas instead came up with 5 proofs that work even if the universe is eternal. It was quite genius. Unfortunately, because of that, he neglected to use what I think was even a stronger argument, which was the Kalam cosmological argument, that it's been renamed that in our generation. And there was another thinker named Bonaventure who was using the Kalam cosmological argument, which taught that the universe had a beginning. But Aquinas thought that was a no-brainer. Of course, if the universe had a beginning, that proves God exists. But I'm going to take on the much harder task of proving God exists, even if the universe did not have a beginning. So I've always found that to be quite interesting. Now, when Galileo started to try to push for the Copernican view, called the heliocentric view, that the sun is the center, he had some support from other thinkers, from other mathematicians, other church authorities. Even the Cardinal Maffeo Barberini praised Galileo, and they were friends. And later we'll see that Barberini became Pope a few years later. And when he did become Pope, Galileo got even more favors from Pope Urban. There were other models around from Christian astronomers. Virtually all the astronomers were Christians. The Copernican model, was the most radical. But it too stood, as Tom Holland, author of Dominion, puts it, recognizably in a line of descent from a long and venerable tradition of Christian scholarship. So the point I want to make here is that the Copernican model and other models that were around didn't just appear out of the blue and didn't appear out of the motivation to be anti-religious or anti-Christian. It was just part of the evolution of the science at the time, which was called natural philosophy. And it was just the progress that was being made as they were studying the universe that God had made and trying to figure out how it works. Now, if Galileo's views and Copernicus's views had been demonstrable in the 17th century, things would have turned out very differently from what we're going to see. Because even as long ago as Origen, the church father, Basil, the church father, and Augustine in the 5th century, there was a principle that Aquinas affirmed in the 13th century, that if study unearthed a proven fact about the world that apparently contradicted something that was said in the Bible, that the church should consider a reinterpretation of the text. They should seek a new and more truthful way to read the relevant passage of Scripture. So rather than say, well, the Bible's wrong, the Scripture text is wrong, maybe our interpretation is wrong. And I still think that's a great principle to work on. There are times when you interpret a Scripture a certain way, and then you discover some of the truth that, well, if that is true, then what I think this text means might not be true. Is there another way to read the text that I haven't thought of? And it turns out that there are sometimes other ways. Now, this method has been lampooned by atheists as just being hypocritical and just, kind of fudging the truth. But no, I think it's a genuine attempt to say, look, if something is true and God should be the author of truth, then there shouldn't be a contradiction. If there seems to be one, then the mistake is not with God and his word. The mistake is more likely with me in my interpretation. And I think
Michael,
to deal with it.
Michael, just on that point, it seems that there is a double standard sometimes between how we in the 21st century understand the sun will rise at such and such a time and set at another time. And when we read it in the Bible, we don't apply that same understanding. Instead, we think that, that's
Geocentric.
that implies that geocentric, that the sun goes around the earth, when in fact it might be written that way for exactly the same reason that we talk about the sun rising and setting today, simply because we're writing from, or we're saying those things from a reference frame which happens to be standing on the planet. So relative to us, even now, we talk about sunrise and sunset. And so I don't think it's at all ad hoc to say, well, maybe they had the exact same reason when the Bible was written. You're writing from a geocentric, or not a geocentric, but you're writing from the reference frame standing on Earth. And so that's why they use the same terms that we use today as far as sunrise and sunset.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, ancient people may not have learned some of the knowledge that our century has, but the people weren't stupid. They were intelligent people, and they knew the difference between figurative speech and metaphor and something meant literally, and the benefits of speaking from about that which we are perceiving as the framework as you're talking about. And so, I think it's unfair to think that the ancients were really stupid and we're the only smart ones. We could have a whole live stream on, should the whole Bible be interpreted literally? What does that even mean? But we'll leave that for another time. But it was part of the church's teaching that you consider to reinterpret what you had previously interpreted if something appears to be in conflict. But the point is, Galileo's arguments and Copernicus's had not yet met that threshold of proof that it was really true. So the church held its ground. And so when Galileo championed the Copernican model, just like when Copernicus did, both the data and the consensus of other scientists or natural philosophers were still against the model. It wasn't until later when Johann Kepler, Christian, born in 1571, lived to 1639, he realized that the orbits were elliptical. That was the big key to the evidence becoming available that the heliocentric view was correct. And then Newton, another century later, his theory of gravity explained why these heavenly bodies moved the way they did, why they orbited rather than just lassoed off into space. And at that point, you had a bit more of a coherent system of astronomy and physics that actually agreed with the observations, and so they could make improved predictions. But that didn't happen in one single eureka moment. Newton himself says, "If I have seen any further, it's by standing on the shoulders of giants." And that is, I mentioned that just to emphasize again the continuation factor between the Middle Ages and what was being done there in terms of natural philosophy, which just progressively moved into what we call modern science.
Okay, I'd like to just interject something here because this sounds remarkably similar to what is pretty much a standard phenomenon anytime a major scientific paradigm is changed. Several years ago, when I was doing a grad course in philosophy of science, specializing in how paradigms change in science, I think our textbook was by a philosopher of science known as Kitcher. But whenever we see a major change in some understanding in science, there is usually a initial rejection of that, a high demand for a high degree of proof, and then a slow acceptance that follows after that. And that has to do, for example, relativity, for quantum mechanics. Whenever there's a major thing here, there's initial resistance because it's going against the ruling paradigm, so to speak. And so what I'm seeing here is actually just par for the course. The scientists of the day were calling for, well, let's see some more evidence for this.
Exactly.
And maybe a certain amount of initial reluctance because this is the way we're seeing it now, but we're open to that. But we need some pretty impressive evidence, or at least significant evidence before that. And that is no different from the way science works even today.
Exactly. That's a great summary of the point I'm making there, for sure. You also have to realize we're in the context of the early Reformation here. And the Catholic inquisitors, who, if you recall from our last session, were committed to making sure that heresy didn't take over, they were just going to let anybody interpret scripture any way they pleased, which is what their concern was about the Protestants. And so they investigated Galileo's claims really carefully to see whether they measured up both to scripture and to natural philosophy or science. So they asked for the proof, as you said. So after a thorough investigation, here's how Tom Holland sums up what happened. In 1616, eminent astronomers had been consulted, the temperature of expert opinion on the matter scrupulously taken. A panel of 11 theologians delivered their considered judgment that certain proofs for heliocentrism did not exist, and that it should therefore be condemned as foolish and absurd in philosophy. And by using the term philosophy, they mean what we mean by science. So this is absurd natural philosophy. This is absurd science. So continued speculation about the Earth revolving around the sun, though, was permissible. Just provide the proof. So Cardinal Bellarmino, who was the one that kind of headed up the investigation, he even assured Galileo that the church would reconsider its opinion. But he said, I will not believe that there is such a demonstration until it is shown it to me. So again, a high standard being demanded. And so this is not sort of religion against science. This is the scientists of the day demanding proof.
No, as they're demanding it, they're using, like, obviously there's a translation issue and sorry, my daughter's playing piano in the background here, but um, are they when you use the terms absurd and that kind of thing? Were they like flaming him at all? Like, is this a we're gonna mock how stupid this sounds, or is it a situation where they are those words don't mean the foolish aspect that they do today?
Yeah, I don't think it was an ad hominem attack on Galileo that he was a fool, but the model just didn't measure up. There just wasn't any evidence for it. I mean, think today about different theories that people come up with, and they're called crazy or foolish. Why? Well, because there just isn't enough good evidence for it. So I think taking Cardinal Bellarmino at his word when he says, we will reconsider this. Honestly, we will. You just got to give us a proof here, and until then, we won't. Or until then, I'm not going to believe it. So yeah, I don't think it's like our internet discourse. So Galileo became very frustrated through this. Okay, he was not allowed to promote this theory openly anymore. You can still speculate about it. And he got very frustrated because Protestant astronomers were free to make the case for heliocentrism without any other concerns. But he was also worried about his friend, Barberini, who was now Pope Urban VIII. He was afraid that this guy was making a huge mistake that would make him a laughingstock, the papacy a laughingstock, and the church a laughingstock. And so in talking with Pope Urban, he convinced him to give him a little more leeway, and Pope Urban gave Galileo permission to revisit the Copernican model as long as he treated it as a hypothesis only. All right, so there's some leeway being given here. So now Galileo went to work. He spent the next 6 years working on his masterpiece, which he called the Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. Translated in today's language, that would be debate on the two main worldviews in the world. And it's a fictional conversation. We've seen books like that before. C.S. Lewis has written books like that, fictional conversation between a Copernican, which represented Galileo's views, and an Aristotelian. And then they had a third guy who was sort of the more neutral person in between these two competing worldviews. Now, the book had an obvious bent towards the Copernican model, but Galileo had to be careful, and he was trying to be consistent with the Pope's expectations that the book be balanced, and he was only treating heliocentrism hypothetically. So he included what he knew from conversations with his best friend, or I don't know if his best friend, but his friend, the Pope's favorite argument. And apparently Pope Urban's favorite argument was something like this: God could surely, in his infinite power and wisdom, have made the world in any manner he wanted, and that could be unthinkable by us how he actually did that. And at the same time, he could have it appear to us in any way that he wanted. I think I've heard similar arguments in the mouths of some, dare I say, young earth creationists at times. God could have done it any way he wanted, and we couldn't even understand it, and he could make the world appear to us in any way that he wanted. And so, this is the continuation of the argument from Pope Urban, and so what folly it would be for any natural philosopher, read scientist, to limit and restrict the divine power and wisdom to some particular fancy of his own. So, a stern warning, for any scientist, that you better be really sure of what you're saying you're saying God did it this way when God could do it anyway, even a way you can't think of, or none of us could think of. And it was a way to kind of almost put the last word on the subject, right?
Now, it seems to me that could be used on either way. It could be used.
Yes.
It could be used by the Copernicans. It could be used by the Ptolemies. It could be used.
And I tried to find some evidence of what Urban meant by that and what Galileo meant, because here's the key mistake that Galileo made. He put those words in his fictional dialogue in the mouth of the Aristotelian, who he had given a name, Simplicio, which had double meaning, but one of the meanings was a simpleton. And in the dialogue, he comes off as quite a stupid fellow. And so he's put Pope Urban's favorite argument into the mouth of this guy. Now, was he thinking, okay, well, Urban is thinking this is a good argument against a Copernican scientist. Well, I'm going to turn it around and show that it can be used against him, an Aristotelian. I didn't find any evidence that that's what happened. That's what Galileo was thinking. It could be, but the problem was he just put it in the mouth of this simple-minded character, and he had just insulted not only his friend but the Pope. And so what many people have attributed to this war between religion and science is much better explained by personal and political variables.
Would you say that's
to do with any conflict?
Would you say that was the turning point? It seems to me that that was a very bad move on Galileo's part, just the way he worded that. I'm even a little bit confused as to why he would try and argue for a heliocentric solar system in the format of a debate between different people, rather than
because he thought he had the best arguments. In fact, Urban's response there came at the end of Galileo trying to give his proof, his argument, his evidence for an explanation for how the tides exist. And Galileo thought that he had nailed it. Everyone agrees now that he didn't. He was completely wrong. in the dialogues, his explanation for how the tides existed.
Mm-hmm.
So I think he thought he had the better arguments, but even still he didn't. He still didn't have a good argument here. And he just made a dumb mistake of being sarcastic and insulting his friend, the Pope. So you can imagine now, this is the Pope. He's the leader of this extremely powerful organization. And so all of the Pope's consultants and advisors are just going to turn on Galileo and say, you've got to do something about this. This guy has insulted you. He's insulted the church. And he's throwing all your generosity that he had given to Galileo over the previous decade or so. It was just being sort of flung back in your face. And so you can imagine that Urban felt himself called upon to defend his own personal dignity as an Italian man, as well as the authority of what they viewed as the universal church. And so they summoned Galileo to Rome to be put on trial. So as Glenn Scrivener in his book, The Air We Breathe, says, still at this stage, the evidence and the scientific community were still leaning the other way. But the irony in this whole thing is that this famous faith versus science trial, it was actually the church that was demanding proof. It wasn't saying accept something on faith. The church was demanding proof, and Galileo was kind of demanding blind assent, although he didn't think it was blind. But as it turns out, his arguments just weren't good enough even then to prove that his model was correct.
So it really appears that the church, theologically, they were prepared to go either way, and I think you could read that into Pope Urban's comment there, but the problem was the science of the day. So it's really a conflict between the science of the day and a new paradigm that's coming up. And it just so happens that Pope Urban is actually more influenced by the science of the day. And plus, he's been insulted.
And that's the way.
Bad move on.
Yeah. And as you said before, that's the way science works, right? I mean, a new theory comes up. The people who were believing the old theory just don't immediately say, oops, I guess you're right. They try to defend their theory, see if there's any adjustments that have to be made, if there's a way to defend the theory against being falsifiable or against being falsified. But once it gets to the point that it's falsified, okay, now we give it up and we move on to the next. But until then, you're defending your theory, right?
Yeah. I know it sounds remarkably, and I'm going to say something here that's going to be controversial, but remarkably similar to what is going on today between intelligent design and, let's say, natural Darwinism, that there's the ruling paradigm, which categorically rules out any intelligent mind behind the origin and diversity of life. Right. And I see a lot of similarities here. I mean, I'm involved in that debate, but that'll be for another discussion.
Yeah, I agree with you. I see a lot of similarities as well.
Is it just holding on to a worldview? Like, if your worldview looks like there's some core things to it, even if it's not really core, but if it casts doubt on some stuff that you hold dear, that you think is how things work, you start pulling out some foundational bricks, even though there might not be foundational bricks. You're worried that it's all going to fall apart on you.
Sure. This is part of human nature. I think we all do this, even with our own little theories about everyday things. We hold on to it, maybe because of the evidence, but probably because of other types of reasons as well, more pragmatic reasons, or because this is connected to some other things that are much more important. So if I can't give up A, because then that means I'm going to have to give up B, and I can never give up B. And so those type of connections are always going on. And I just think we need to recognize them in ourselves and in other people, and just continue to say, okay, I need to actually rely upon whether this is true and the evidence supports it being true, rather than the fact that I want it to be true because I really would like it to be true.
Now, this also brings up the role of human pride here. And when I finished my first degree in physics, I thought, very naively, of course, but I thought I had a pretty good idea how the universe works. I'm embarrassed to say that now, but that was at the end of my first degree, undergraduate in physics. But I was sitting in the science library around that time, near the end. I think it was my last year there, and it was towards the end of the year. And I had a little bit of free time. I was reading one of the journals there, one of the physics journals, I think. And I was shocked to find out that at some of these conferences that physicists have, some of those lectures and discussions actually got quite heated, very heated. And you would have different people with their pet theories challenging other people with their dearly held theories in physics, no less, in physics. And so that was a kind of a turning point for me in the area of science, because I had naively thought science is completely objective. We're just doing what the math said and the data says. But wow, that was the first crack in the door, and it was a pretty big one to find out that basically when I read the article, I thought this is just human pride here interfering with science, with the advance of science. I mean, heated, very vitriolic, personal attacks by some physicists against other physicists. So we're not seeing something very different here. The pride is here, maybe slightly more restrained. The Pope has been has maybe his authority quite challenged or maybe impinged upon by Galileo's remarks. Galileo has made a bad move with how he depicted the Pope's quote, or what context he put it in. But at the end of the day, if they could have just dispensed with their pride, we might have a very different situation.
I think that's true of all scientific endeavor, not just the current generation of physicists that you may know, nor just Galileo's time, but everything in between. I mean, that's just human nature. Which,
Yeah.
and you know what that points to?
Politics, media.
And it points to how wonderful the scientific method is, because the scientific method is meant to be a check and balance against the human nature that lends towards pride and attacking someone else and having other pragmatic reasons for holding a view rather than the evidence itself. And I think we as Christians, we need to recognize, how wonderful a method the scientific method is. It only becomes a problem when it becomes scientism, or when it also becomes anti-supernaturalism. Those are the two extremes that some
And
scientists contend to.
There's also another aspect of science that's really grown today. The scientific method and experimental science is what I would call the gold standard, as you've just described. But human nature likes to we want to learn stuff sometimes the fast way. We want to look for shortcuts. And so there's another kind of science now I'd call inferential science, where we start with real data and observations, but we infer conclusions that are perhaps too difficult or impractical to actually reproduce those conclusions. And so sometimes if the leap isn't too huge, like say for forensic science, it can arrive at pretty good conclusions that are acceptable in a court of law beyond any reasonable doubt. But if the leaps become huge, or a series of large leaps, that's where I see the beginnings of some conflict between faith and what we might call science. But it's not really faith in science, it's faith in the more extreme aspects of inferential science, where inferences are being made that we cannot really reproduce.
Okay. Well, let's jump in and see what happened to Galileo. So 1633 now, the Inquisition convicted Galileo of a strong suspicion of heresy. Now, there was no torture, despite the many times that's been said that he's been tortured or burned at the stake, nothing of the sort. And his imprisonment amounted to a short stay in the home of the Archbishop of Siena. And he was allowed to move home that same year to live under house arrest in his own villa in Florence. And he died 10 years later. Now, it's never been, the Galileo affair, as it's often called, has never been the rival claims of Scripture and the natural philosophy that were at issue. Because as Cardinal Bellarmino pointed out back in 1616, both of them served to confirm that definite backing for Copernicus did not yet exist, either from the Scriptures or from the science. Nor even in the final reckoning was it an argument about whether the sun moved or the earth moved. Something much more seismic was going on in the political realm here. Galileo had been put on trial as Catholic fortunes amid the killing fields of Germany appeared in desperate straits. That's the way that John Dickson, author of Bullies and Saints, puts it. So there was fighting going on in Germany between Catholics and Protestants, and the Protestants were winning some of those, and Pope Urban was in a snarl of a complex web of alliances and rivalries, and he was in no mood to cede an inch of his authority to this supercilious and egocentric natural philosopher. I mean, he had really big things on his plate, and that he had to deal with. And the Catholic Church, rightly or wrongly, was concerned about the Protestants not only taking over, but people were being killed on both sides, unfortunately. Now, this leads us to the Protestant response to this. As I've said in the other videos that we've done, the Protestants' response to certain things has not been what I would have hoped. And I developed a hypothesis early on as I was doing this research that I wonder if maybe it was Protestants that started such and such, and this is another one of those such and suches right here. They're in a war though, and so you can imagine them wanting to attribute to the Pope the blackest motives. I mean, look what people are doing now to Putin. Is he deserving of all those motives? Maybe. I don't know for sure. I mean, I don't know the guy, but there's a strong push to, to make him to be the devil, and maybe he is. But that's just the way it is in war. So the Protestants saw the condemnation of Galileo as an illustration of everything they detested and feared about the Roman Catholic Church. And so you had early scientists, Christian scientists like Robert Boyle, the father of modern chemistry, and the poet John Milton, who were the first to fix upon this incident of Roman Catholic perversity. There were parallels with the Luther story, Too Strong to Ignore. And they thought that a pioneering thinker like Galileo was just being shot down by an ignorant Pope.
Well, that is interesting because it's actually, we saw this with the one other discussion that we had here with you, Michael, where one side was trying to make the other side look worse. And so the stories lost nothing in the telling. I'd imagine as the story of Galileo circulated amongst the Protestant people, they certainly didn't tone it down at all. If anything, it might have been ramped up slightly.
Yeah, and this is what historians. There's a consensus about this. This is what happened. The Protestants took over here, and then we're going to see the idea of conflict between science and Catholicism grew and expanded to where we're at in this day. So, like Milton was a Puritan, English Puritan, and he visited Florence and he visited Galileo and saw him as a prisoner to the Inquisition in his own home, mind you, and thinking that the Franciscan and Dominican clergy were controlling the thought of the people. And this is how Protestants in years to come would portray their Catholic opponents: fanatics, too bigoted to permit the study of the heavens, which is not at all what was going on. All this stuff grew out of the Catholic Christians who were doing the study. Galileo, meanwhile, became one of their own, even though Galileo was a Catholic. He wasn't a Protestant, and not a very devout one either. He had children out of wedlock. A martyr to superstition, they painted Galileo at. He was a Titan in the noblest tradition of Luther. He had dispelled with the brilliance, or they had dispelled with the brilliance of his discoveries with the murk of popery and Aristotle.
No, were the Protestants actually looking at the discoveries that Galileo made and saying he was accurate at the time, and they were saying that at the time, or is this like hindsight? Let's take advantage of this mistake that was made by the Catholic Church.
You have to distinguish between the Protestant scientists and just the Protestants in general, who were maybe leaders in the Reformation. Protestant scientists and Catholic scientists, they all knew what the facts were, and they shared the facts with each other. And in fact, the next sentence I was going to read said, the natural philosophers knew better. They knew themselves as Christians bonded together in a single common endeavor. So that actually is the answer to your question for the scientific or natural philosophy community. But those beyond the science who didn't really know the science, they twisted it to their benefit, which is something that we all are tempted to do, right?
So the scientists at this time, when the Protestant, we'll call them liars, just because it's an easy word.
Exaggerators.
Exaggerators. So these exaggerators, are they at the time saying Galileo's right, he's been attacked by the church, and the
Not
scientists still.
necessarily. I mean, some might have leaned towards him, and some against it because the science wasn't definitive yet.
Okay, so they're still not settled at that time.
Right.
I like using the word
Science is not settled. There's also another aspect of advancing a paradigm, and it has to do with some political savvy, some rhetoric. So knowing how to, it's politics, basically. I was at an academic conference in Leeds, University of Leeds in the UK. And on the last day, one of the scholars from Oxford gave a little talk. And he said, you know, if you really want to change, if you want to get what you're discovering or what you are publishing, if you want to get that out there, very few read the academic journals in the average population.
Right.
He urged us at the conference to start publishing more in the popular literature. And it all has to do a lot with being wise enough to get your point across in an attractive way to a wider audience and not burn bridges. That burning a bridge is a bad idea, and we can see that Galileo did that. But so if I were to sum up Galileo, and please feel free to unsummarize me and give your own summary, Michael, but it seems that it started with not really a conflict between scientific paradigms, but a slow change from one ruling paradigm to the other. And the ruling paradigm demanded some pretty significant evidence before they were willing to concede that they've been mistaken for a very long time and go with this new paradigm. But in the meantime, Galileo in his was maybe politically naive and insulted one friend he had in very high power. And that really turned the tables against him personally. And then along came the Protestant people who wanted to use this incident and ramp it up a little bit. And despite the fact we might think, oh, it was probably the atheists that started this, that really fueled this, what you're suggesting is maybe it was actually the Protestants who took this and ran with it and got the thing, gave it some momentum. Initially. And then later on, initially. And then later on, it was maybe the people who today endorse scientism or the materialists who then pick this ball up and run with it. But the whole thing is misrepresenting what actually happened.
Yeah. John Dixon summarized it this way. He says the church's actions against Galileo were undoubtedly misguided and grossly unfair. But the story has been blown out of proportion, adding fuel to the fire, as it were, of our outrage at the Inquisition's hateful dogmatism. And so Protestants initiated it, but it was taken up pretty early by the philosophes in France, in the French Revolution, Voltaire, and others like him that were also quite anti-Catholic. And then it got spread slowly to other parts of Christianity as well. So the way that I heard a discussion about it today is that it began with the Protestants attacking the Catholics, and then the philosophes attacking the Catholics as well. The philosophes being primarily non-theists, atheists. And then in the 19th century, it became liberal Protestants attacking historical Protestants. And then now it's got to the point where it's non-theists attacking all Christians and religions. And I think there's some truth to this, and not some truth to it. I think there's a consensus that those who have studied this issue in the last 100 years know that the conflict thesis which is that there's an inevitable conflict between science and religion, and in particular Christianity, just is not true. And where did it come from? It came from this initial spark of Protestants against the Galileo, not just the Galileo story, but other things that were happening within the Catholic Church at the time. And then it got picked up from there. And so the people that really picked it up, though, were in the 19th century, John Draper and Andrew White. They each wrote a book in the latter half of the 19th century that were really instrumental in changing the thinking of our age, and still their views hold sway over those that have not been exposed to the most recent historical consensus that is out there. And I think it's really important that we kind of set the record straight on this issue, because this is the same talking points are being made by sort of the secular humanist type atheists. They're just repeating the stuff from the 19th century, and the 19th century Draper and White just picked it up from what was said the century before, and so on. And so in the 20th century, here's what Dixon says: 20th century investigations of the trial of Galileo on the basis of the documents that the Inquisition or the Church let be available, that had to do with the Inquisition. And so the Galileo affair is part of the Inquisition. And so the documents about the Inquisition were all made available, as I said in our last time together. So they've been studied inside and out, and they point out the importance of the specific historical and political circumstances in which the Galileo trial took place. And these investigations have begun to be effective in eroding, though not erasing, the belief in the conflict thesis, the inevitable conflict between science and religion that grew out of this 19th century understanding.
What's very interesting here is that this whole gigantic mess that has gone on for centuries could be converged down to a single statement that Galileo included in that dialogue he had with, where he put the Pope's words in the mouth of this character named Simplicio. If that one statement if he had not done that, maybe it's not just one statement, but it sounds to me that that statement was a turning point. Just a simple statement can actually change the course of history and create a gigantic mess, several hundred years later.
Yeah, if you're ever tempted to do something you shouldn't do, who knows what the butterfly effect of it will be, right?
Yeah, this is an example of the butterfly effect. Yeah. Yeah, wow. It's
and you even have to wonder, like, if that cardinal or the Pope at the time and Galileo weren't actually friends at the beginning, would the Pope have even cared that much? But it was a personal attack instead of just a...
maybe he would have even supported Galileo. Yeah. Interesting. The investigations by historians in the last 100 years not only help lessen the amount of belief there is in the conflict thesis, but it also led Pope John Paul II to publicly acknowledge that the Inquisition was wrong, to have judged Galileo the way it did in 1992, publicly admitted that. So better late than never. And they admitted it. I'd like to finish on this statement by Scrivener. He says, to focus on the Galileo affair obscures the rather significant reality that in the 16th and 17th centuries, Christian scientists educated in Christian universities and following a Christian tradition of scientific and mathematical speculation overturned a pagan cosmology and physics, which is what the Aristotelian and Ptolemaic view was, and arrived at conclusions that would have been unimaginable within the confines of the ancient Greek scientific traditions. That's the real scientific story here, that happened. And it was science and Christianity together, not in conflict. Yeah. That's the real story.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Michael, for bringing this. Kirk, do you have anything to close, or you?
No, I really enjoyed this kind of expose on the real story of Galileo.
And you're back again next week, I think, Michael?
Yes.
And what are we talking about next week?
You know what? It might just change. I think I was originally going to go back and show a little bit more of the history of reason and progress that led to the pre-science that led to Galileo and Kepler and Boyle. But I've been rethinking a bit that maybe I've made the point enough here. So I'm just going to write you a blank check right now.
Sure.
Sure.
We'll set it
We'll,
up for a couple of days.
we'll surprise everybody next week.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
I know that you have some other really good stuff. So
Yeah, it's just a matter of choosing.
even though we don't. Yeah, it's just a matter of nailing it down, which we'll do before
Awesome.
next Tuesday night.
It's always hard to know how much I'm going to get through in one session.
So next Tuesday night, same time, 8 o'clock Central, 9 o'clock Eastern, whatever it is in Vancouver.
6 o'clock.
6 o'clock.
My time,
Oh
yeah.
man, it's late night for me and Kirk here, but
Even later
Yeah.
for me than you, Sheldon.
I know.
See, I should still be able to get out and play some pickleball,
Nice.
although I'm not going to do it today. I'm a little injured.
No, dude.
But this timing will work out fine for me.
Awesome. So we'll see you again next week. Don't forget, if you're watching now or later, feel free to hit the like and hit the subscribe button and the bell to get notified when we go live again. Don't forget to comment and leave a question. If you want to talk privately, go to kirkdurston.com, send in a message there. We'll be sure to get to it. We do try and answer all the comments. If we forget to answer one or we miss it, don't forget you can always ask again. We would love to hear from you. All right, we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye for now.